Hello and welcome to Seeking Heaven, the Near-Death Experience and Other Phenomena. And welcome. If you haven't subscribed, like, make comments, watch my past episodes, and be sure to check out my Ascension School, academyofdivinewisdom.com, where I have events and courses. And if you sign up, you also get a Christ-like meditation. And so check that out. And I am going, and thank you for watching. And let's move right into our guest. Our guest today is Michael Flem. He is a researcher and a historian who's very passionate about this book that came to be, Visions of Atlantis. Now, he did a first part, you've got to see it, where he talks about how the book was created, how it changed him spiritually. Well, actually, a lot of ways. His thinking process is really fascinating. And now today he's going to get into from where he got his hard research and now how it moved into his research with channeling of Atlantis. I'm going to bring it back on and we're going to dive right in. Michael, welcome back.
Hi, how are you?
So last time we talked about how you wrote it in terms, and I've read your book, so I understand what you're talking about. You don't need to do your research on Atlantis. This book has it all. And so the beginning, how it covers every aspect of what's written from Plato on, just all time where Atlantis could be, and
sure.
A lot of historical research in that. How did you, from that point, from Atlantis, that you started looking into, and why did you start looking into channeled information and who?
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, you have to talk about Plato, I suppose, if you're writing a book on Atlantis, because, traditionally people think he's the first person to ever talk about it. But, as I discovered through my research, that's factually inaccurate, because if people really read his dialogues, the setting of that dialogue where Critias is talking to Socrates is during this celebration called Lesser Panacea. And this was a historically true celebration that was about 180 years. It was founded about 180 years prior to when Plato wrote his two dialogues, Critias and Timaeus. And he wrote those in 360, 361 BC. So you're talking in around 530 BC. The Athenians had a ceremony where they celebrated the defeat of, Athena defeating the Atlantides.
Oh, you mean like a sports
thing? And then Plato's dialogue, well, it was like a procession where they marched, and it was a very somber procession where Athena, they're carrying a shield describing their war with the Atlantides. Now, it's odd to me when people say, well, Plato made this up. It's like, well, Plato told a more detailed account of Atlantis that was told in a dialogue involving characters. But a lot of the things he said, if you really look at it, are not fantastical. It's not a mythological account. The only mythological aspect of the account is the final ending cliffhanger where he says, and Zeus convened with all the gods and was disappointed in humanity.
It's a little crazy, yeah.
And then spoke thusly, and it ends. And you never get to know what Zeus said or how the civilization ended.
Right.
So everything up until that point is a very basic factual account of, a mid-Atlantic subcontinental island with a military empire that stretched into the Mediterranean, that was at war with these people. And so as I went through more sources from Sanskrit texts in India, some of them happened to mention similar stories. When I looked at people from that actually were critics of Plato at his own time, it was really similar to today. It was a bunch of academics that said, no, this is what the Egyptians were really telling Solon, and no, Plato, he's a trickster, he's always making stuff up, and he took psychedelics and things like this. But as time went on, in the Eleusinian mysteries, but as time went on, I reached a point where, chronologically, the book goes, through the ancient sources, Greek, Roman, then it goes into kind of some folklore from the Dark Ages, but it really picks up again in the Age of Exploration, where it's almost like a whole new understanding of Atlantis, this idea that when the conquistadors started to come to North America in the Bahamas, Mexico, places like Cortez, Columbus, people like this, a lot of them thought, oh, this is Atlantis. This is this place that Plato was talking about, because they had finally reached this new frontier. And so that's a really cool part of the book, where you see how the discovery of the new world opened this reinterpretation of the story, you know, and then that evolved into when the industrial era came around, and you have people like Abraham Lincoln's friend Ignatius Donnelly, who was a congressman. You know, he wasn't a guy with a weird blog or something. This was a sitting congressman who was friends with Abraham Lincoln, who wrote a book that's still in print 141 years later,
Yeah.
The Antediluvian World, where he says, how has nobody taken this seriously? Look at all these connections between the Basque language, between Nahuatl language in Mexico, between why is there an Atlas mountain in Morocco and they use the same word for water that they use in Mexico? Maybe there was some truth to this Plato story.
Right.
And then the story kind of, the historical sources end. I abruptly end there.
Really? Is that what happened?
Yeah, because that's the same. So that was
Oh.
1882 that Ignatius Donnelly wrote that book. And then 4 years later is when Frederick Oliver starts hearing voices in his head next to Mount Shasta in Eureka, California. 17-year-old kid starts hearing voices in his head that say, hey, tell my story. I used to live in Atlantis and I'm using you as a channel. And I pick up from there. And that's a hell of a ride, because the story that person tells is, I think, alone worth reading the book for, because that's such a difficult book to actually read. I mean, I've read it 7 times. You know, it's 480 pages in 19th century channeled English. You know, I don't recommend it.
It's going to be painful, yeah, because some of
It
these
is
older
painful.
books are the wording and their expressions. It's just different, yeah.
It's excruciating book, and it's not even told in order. Sometimes there's sequential jumps, and it's
Oh,
a
boy.
channeled audio,
Oh, my gosh.
semi-automatically written book. And he claims he was aware when he was not in a trance like Edgar Cayce. He was
really?
aware,
Okay.
but he said that sometimes he would write 90, 100 pages in one day, and then some days he would write 1 page in a day. And so he wrote this book over the course of 3 years, and the universe he's describing in the year 11,160 BC, specifically that date, which I show later in the book in the archaeological record, is a very important date, you know, for major climactic things that even, you know, Graham Hancock and other people have pointed to that gap between around 12,000 BC and 10,000 BC, 9,500 BC, where it suggests from the geological record that indeed there was a cataclysm, natural or otherwise. But, you know, it's interesting what that kid says about his occult preceptor's past life in the island of Poseid in the culture of Atlantis in the year 11,160 BC. It's actually, to me, it read like a script from Star Wars. The only problem is the Star Wars franchise didn't come out for 90 years after that book.
Maybe that's why so many people identify with Star Wars. There's a, you know, galactic whole track stuff, memory going on.
And in fact, the final chapter of my book, I explicitly explore that, where I say, look, there's no evidence that the writers of Star Wars did anything but talk to Joseph Campbell. We know that he was a consultant on that.
Yeah. Oh, really? Was he
Oh,
really?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Joseph Campbell was a primary consultant for, at least for Return of the Jedi, but I'm positive that for the whole franchise. In fact, they were friends. Him and Lucas were friends for years until the end of his life.
Well,
Yeah.
and if we paraphrase and help me out here, Michael, Star Wars, you basically, if you have the Jedi with the light beam, that is control over matter, which is what
Right.
I remember Atlantis being control over matter and the elements and water and power
Of
and
course.
crystals. And
Yes.
then you had the bad forces who wanted to control everybody and control for gain
The
and to
Empire, the Sith.
the
Yeah, of
empire.
course.
It's the
Well,
same kind of thing. You get those
it's the
odds.
same thing. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's really bizarre. And I mean, even in one point in the book, I'll just say this, but one point in the book, this is a 17-year-old kid writing in 1886, okay? In the age of, basically in his town, electricity had been kind of deployed, but not really. It's still, I show a picture of his town in that time, and it's the Wild West, the closing of the frontier,
Mm-hmm.
But he's saying, well, we're flying over parts of North America at this time, and we're in our ship, cigar-shaped ship, and we're going at this rate over this part of the Grand Canyon. And at that time, I'm getting a holographic, and he can't use these words, but he's basically saying an image of my girlfriend pops up on this mirror in my ship. And it's like, that's Princess Leia. Like, you're basically describing Han Solo talking to Princess Leia on the Millennium Falcon. Except the only problem is,
You're right.
you're writing this book in 1886. And so
This
this
is
goes
astounding
on.
if you think about it.
It is. And nobody has been able to explain that, because I, again, skeptic that I am, was like, okay, what other science fiction was out at this time?
Nothing.
And really,
There was no
the
word.
only thing he could have really read was like, no, there was like
Mary
20,000
Shelley's
Leagues Under the Sea.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
That, but Captain Nemo is not in a flying ship that's powered by a theoretical physics that he describes in the book. You know what I mean?
No, it's like
So
old industrial age, steampunky kind of stuff. Yeah, it's not
exactly,
that.
exactly. And
So,
what
no,
was even crazier is that, later on, when I just took samplings from other channelers throughout the early and mid to late 20th century, it's interesting that they all seem to talk about, they use different words, or maybe the shape of this is different, but it's like they're basically all describing the same general world around the same general time, and some focusing on the latter portion of the civilization, and some focusing on, other civilizations that were concurrent with Atlantis, that people think it's just Atlantis and that's it. But it's like, Cayce didn't say that. Cayce said there were 5 to 7 advanced civilizations concurrently running on the earth.
Besides
he has
Atlantis.
3 total destructions of the civilization alone of Atlantis. He says civilization where the Gobi Desert is now. There was Lemuria before Atlantis. There was the beginnings of Atlantis, which was concurrent with the end of Lemuria. And there was another advanced civilization, he says, in another part of the world. And it's like, it leads me to what Hancock and other people were saying, like, stop focusing on this island in the Atlantic that Plato was talking about, as if that's it.
Do you think it was different timelines happening? I mean, this is getting into multiverse stuff and parallel realities, but do you how there can be Michael here?
Yeah.
And there's the Michael that travels, the astral travel Michael at night when he sleeps. And then there could be Michael, a person on another planet, or there can be the same Michael here, but another reality of here. I mean, look, this is deep stuff. Do you think that's what they're talking about?
No, they actually...
Or 3 physical at the same time.
Yes. No, what's funny is that like, even though these people are channeling like astral records, they'll tell you. Actually, Cayce says that to you. He's like, I'm giving the date in time as you count time, like, so you could understand. And so when he says, when I say the year 50,722 BC, I'm saying like the way you listeners are used to counting time, And so he's giving specific historical dates for, the first destruction of Atlantis, which he claimed was a huge continent. Then the second destruction of Atlantis, 23,000 years later. Then the final destruction of Atlantis, closer to the time Plato said it was, And in these gaps, he's describing concurrent civilizations running at the same time that are at different levels of technology or different, paths totally. Like Atlantis in his explanation and Frederick Oliver's was basically the United States. It was obsessed with technology and military hardware and a material science view.
And also maybe describe what it looks like, because people want to know, what did it look like?
Sure. Well, Cayce doesn't really give too many specific details about like what the cities look like and things like this. But in Frederick Oliver's account, he's very specific. He's very specific. I mean, he's describing the city that Plato was describing. Right. He actually, in his past life, he says, I lived on an island called Poseid, and Plato called it Atlantis. But it's interesting because what's in the middle of Plato's circular city of Atlantis is a statue of Poseidon. So I think they're talking about the same thing.
This dude behind me here.
Exactly.
So what about the rings? What about the rings? I actually have memory of the rings, but within that, it was structurally set up differently. You had what you saw up above, and I don't know if this is true. I'd like to find out from you what you found out. But what I remember is up above, there was a structure, and there was like a military structure, and it was a hierarchy of socially where certain people were, but it was like animals roam free that would not bite you. But then there was a whole thing below that was going on that was water, and people lived there too.
Yeah, they both talk about it in different ways. Like Oliver gives this incredibly detailed, like down a certain level, 5 years living there once he moves to that city. And it's incredible, it's monorail transit. It's basically flying craft that don't use conventional propulsion. Right. He witnesses a criminal being reformed using basically magnetic brain re-entrainment technology. Again, I mean, he's writing this in 1886. It's quite astounding. I mean, and so I tried to show as much of that as I could, and for the most part, besides Plato's of the structure of the city and how the civilization was organized and things like this, there's not a very good window into like, okay, well, but what is it from like the ground level? What would a day in this civilization be?
Oh, you mean like underwater? Did they not talk about the underwater stuff?
Oliver does. Oliver describes a voyage underwater.
Yeah, it's like people live there. They had a city below, a city above, and they had places. What I saw that had people that you could not be. There were aquatic people, and then there were regular looking people that you could take this pill and you could breathe in water. And
like
you
Water
could go
World.
Did they do that there? They had a pill?
Well, isn't it in? Well, he's got gills, I guess, right? Kevin Costner has gills.
I don't know, but then you had like a little, what do you call it? Like the water slides. There were like tubes, and you could go through the tubes to get around. And then they had it. It was just really, but that was down. And then they had a whole different thing up above, and not to mention that, like, what do you call it? Craft landings that I saw. And I'm like, sometimes when you mention like Atlantis, I think it can be triggering because I get really sad because we're on rubber tires right now. I'm still waiting for freaking hovercraft cars.
Right.
Don't you want to get one of those?
It's funny. Like right when I published the book, I saw an ad for some like personal Jetsons. I think it's called the Jetson, and it's like a mini hovercraft that it doesn't go very far. I think the battery is like 20 minutes, but I was like, okay, we're getting closer. But no, it's a really cool part of the book, because I try to, well, I'm quoting directly. I'm not interpreting. I'm quoting what Frederick Oliver said. It's just his quotes are so all over the place in this book that to piece them together took me almost, 5 months alone. And so when I do get like a picture, a vision, if you will, of what this looked like, again, it looks like a script from Star Wars or The Fifth Element or something from the quote unquote future. But I always tell people, remember, the beginning of Star Wars is not a long time in the future. Remember, it's a long time ago.
Absolutely. That's a different way of looking at history. Oh, are you
you know?
kidding? And it also says that if that's the case, either we're ignorant or we've been lied to, or a little bit of both. But if
Sure,
we, in fact, that life goes on and there is reincarnation, that theoretically we should be able to remember these things. Here's a picture I have. I don't know how very good it is, but I like the, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I do like that there that energy source in the middle.
sure.
That's cool. I don't
Mhm.
know what's going on with all this. I don't know what this other stuff is. And then I do have another one, another image.
Yes.
I'm sure you've seen this before. This looks
Mhm.
more familiar, but it looks kind of military looking. It was less military
Right,
looking. But
right.
I think the fact that it looks like to me, like looking at this, I think what my memories, it was similar, but there were pyramids on it. But the thing is, it was a little bit more lavish, and there was some land in there too, and it was more lavish than this and more like paradise.
Mhm.
But it looks like a crop circle, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Doesn't that look
and
like a crop circle?
and it's interesting too because Plato, Casey, and Oliver, none of them give exact dates for the building, let's just say, of that specific city. Which again, I tell people all the time, like the best part, the kicker for me was, this everybody's always debating this question of the lost continent or the lost island or the was it big or was it small and what is Plato talking about? And for me, really, the key to that was the Cayce readings and Rudolf Steiner, who
Hmm.
independently, by the way, independently both said the same thing, and they both have very different dates, but they both basically said, look, this used to be a much bigger landmass that was basically three
Ridiculous.
quarters of the Atlantic Ocean. And then over
That's a lot.
huge. And then over hundreds of thousands of years, natural and
Right.
Casey's case, human caused on one or two occasions
Yeah.
disasters through
Hmm.
misapplication of technology,
Hmm.
eventually was reduced to these small, island chains that Plato describes. And even
Right.
Plato says it was an island that ruled over all the other islands. So he does not describe one island.
It
He
was the
describes an
empire.
archipelago. It was an empire. And then
It
it
was the
had colonies as far as Egypt, Italy, Greece, and North
Oh, yeah.
Africa. That's what Plato says.
Right.
So I
Right.
don't
No.
like when
Yeah.
people say oh, you mean there's a city? And it's like, you're not reading the
It's
book. Plato
massive.
says like England is an island, but there's a British empire that's ruled by
That's
the
actually a good
Navy.
example. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, and so in many ways, like the details matter, but uh, I'll end on this as far as the question about the city. What was interesting is that, I had the big problem of like, Plato still describes when he describes the city, he describes like a very beautiful megalithic architecture and everything, but he still says basically people sailed around in ships. They fought with spears. He's describing a Bronze Age, non-technologically advanced culture. And I was like, But in Oliver's book, he
Okay.
says, I'm talking about the end of the golden age of technology in Atlantis. But he says 800 years after this, it had descended to basically the point where people were fighting with sticks and stones and they had forgotten how to use technology and nobody was building these things anymore. And they basically devolved into this Mad Max dystopia. And that, I think, is what Plato was describing.
I got it. So there's three, and so he only saw a facet of that, whereas
Correct.
Oliver and Casey saw so much more. And think about it. If
Yeah.
it's 150,000 years, I
Right.
mean, come on. I mean, you could have it
Right.
burned and rebuilt by then. I mean, so
I
much could have
mean,
happened. And the
right.
change of guard, your background also is with military history. What about the
Mhm.
military history there? That changed.
Oh my God. I mean, how many wars have we had in the 20th century? That's 100 years. So you're
Right.
talking, let's just conservatively say 50,000 years for the beginning proper of this civilization. I mean, how many changes, like you said, of
Wow.
leadership would you have in 50,000 years? Like, it's almost like impossible to imagine,
It's
you
hard.
know,
Yeah.
it's really hard because, like, I don't think people realize like how different 200 years ago was compared to right now. Like if I
200
took
years
you back
ago.
to
Yeah.
1823, you wouldn't recognize where you were. That's 200
No,
years.
no, a lot of
So
clothes.
go
No,
2,000 years
right.
to when
Oh,
Plato
oh
was, you
gosh.
know,
No.
Plato had already been dead for 360 years, you know. So go back 2,400 years to Plato, then go back 20,000 years to the glory days of Atlantis. I mean, you're talking about like time spans that most people aren't
You
even
know,
used to
so
thinking about.
no, it that alone stretches your brain. So let me ask you this: do you think now you hear a lot with the from a galactic history starseed perspective
Mm-hmm.
that the seeding, of course, Lemuria, and then
Mm-hmm.
some say that Lemuria went to, it was all over the place too. It wasn't just one place. Now they say it's under Mount Shasta, but the point is, which makes sense with the Campbell guy, but that it also, I guess, people transition where they reincarnated or however it happened,
Mm-hmm.
ended up in Atlantis. And so their whole thing, the seeding, that we had the ET technology. So did we start out more advanced with the spacecrafts? And I saw governing the water through, energy through controlling the water with the crystals and the energy and frequency. That's advanced.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're working with the elements, so it was definitely advanced technology merged with spirituality, like much these days you hear like on, like cosmic disclosure, that the ships are propelled through the bioluminescence technology. So
Mm.
it was more advanced. So did it start out more advanced and it just crumble apart and go into more Mad Max? Did it start out more of a golden age?
Yeah, I mean, Casey basically says the beginnings of it were very peaceful, and then shortly thereafter, these factions started forming, like we talked about, the dark side, the light side, and he has his own names for them. Frederick Oliver has his own names, but it's basically that Star Wars biblical, duality. But yeah, and it's interesting because like he even describes like the early flying craft, and they're not like super advanced, sleek, what we would consider a UFO today. They're in Casey's. I mean, think about this for a minute. Casey says at the beginning they used to take the skins, the hides of the megafauna which used to live on that island, and I proved that in the book. They used to find mastodon skeletons in the continental shelf. So that's not speculation. They've found elephant bones in where the ocean is now, when that used to be dry land.
Mm-hmm.
Casey said they used to take the skins of these elephants and basically make a zeppelin, like a balloon, but that it had its own crystal technology, and it was like this weird
That is
steampunk, like,
wild.
yeah, and it's one of the craziest
Oh
readings because
man.
you're like, what are you talking about? But then you go, well, it's just like they're taking archaic design to us that's like probably artistic to them. And instead of like, they don't need to go super fast at that time. They just needed it for like aerial surveillance and changing islands. So it was like a steampunk, but using a crystal entrainment technology, as he describes it, where it would,
Oh
in
man. That's
line of
wild.
sight, like a lighthouse, beam energy and guide these weird balloons made of mastodon skins and things.
Boy,
And
I'm not gonna have weird dreams tonight. Thanks, Michael.
I,
That is crazy.
I wrote the book. How do you think I felt when I was
I
writing
was
all this?
like, that is, I mean, I didn't take a lot to shock me, but just that image alone is bizarre.
It
But
was
I get,
bizarre to me, but it's like, and again, that was, image he gives from 50,000 BC. And then by the time Oliver is channeling, his channeler, his source's life, that's 39,000 years in the future, after multiple destructions and already 3 rises and falls of this civilization. So it's like, I don't even like to talk about it. Like, as a historian, it's such like, and this is no offense to people, or I'm just saying, like, to me, if I wrote a history paper, for example, and I said, well, from the time of Plato to today, we've had a couple changes. There were 1 or 2 things that changed. It's like, I wouldn't graduate school. They'd be like, you're skipping the entire human recorded history of Western civilization. Like, you're missing the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and that's in 2,000 years. So when Casey says the first destruction, was around 50,722 BC, And the second destruction was 28,000 BC. He doesn't really talk about anything in between there. He'll just say, you had a life between these destructions. That's inconceivably long amount of time. So I don't.
Okay. So that's a good project for you. That's a good project for you to find those
tend
missing
to know
years.
like this. It's endless. That's a long one. That'll take me 20 lifetimes to figure that out.
Hey, I'll play along. I'll channel for you. We'll just do this grand experiment. So I want to go there. That sounds cool. I'm ready for it. So look, everybody, buy Michael's book. We're going to continue in this next segment. So stay tuned about what happened. What was the fall and destruction of Atlantis, and what can we learn from it? And are we a part of that? Are we part of do we, if we have memories, what can we learn from that? So buy Michael's book, Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Legacy, and join us. We're going to have fun. So join us in that. So watch the first one too. Bye, Michael.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Please subscribe, like, and make comments, and support this channel by becoming a member. Thank you for your continued support.